Well, as fascinating as all of this has been, we need to talk about the 11th Amendment. Now this is the hardcore stuff that, you ought to go home and tell your families about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because this is the sort of stuff that is mostly of interest to people like me. I come toe-to-toe with the 11th Amendment all the time. But really what it boils down to is the concept that the national government is not going to be a weapon against the states. Okay? It's a recognition that the states matter. Now, also what's kind of behind it is trying to reinforce the idea that states didn't need to worry that the federal government was going to take them over. So it's kind of trying to provide some encouragement about the concept that the states retained rights and the federal government was not taking over. But what's really interesting is that most of the time, if you're trying to enforce the Bill of Rights, you do that in federal court. Who most often is on the other side? Answer, a state or one of the political subdivisions of a state. That's why this 11th Amendment provides what's commonly referred to as sovereign immunity for states. So you can sue a state in federal court, but only to do certain things. And basically, what it boils down to is you can't use the federal government to pick the state government's pocket. You can say that certain decisions that are made by the state may be in violation of the U.S. Constitution. You can require, issue an injunction or a declaration that says, okay, state, you need to conform your conduct and your policies and your practices to the U.S. Constitution. But the federal government is not going to engage in a transfer of wealth from the state to somebody else. Now, the reason I included this Sossaman versus Texas case, this shows how complicated this gets and how it's kind of a good news, bad news situation in some respect. This ARLUPA that's mentioned here is the Religious Liberty in Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And it basically says that if a church wants to build a new facility, land use laws cannot be specifically targeted against the church. That's a big deal these days. The institutionalized persons part of it is people who are locked up in prison. And it again relates to religious liberties. That's the whole reason for it. Well, it so happens in Texas, there was a Muslim guy who said, I'm not getting my dietary meals the way I used to, and that's a problem. So he filed suit under ARLUPA, and the federal court said, you know what, you're absolutely right, you ought to get them. And the reason why he was being deprived of those meals, by the way, is it costs too much. So the state of Texas says, you know, what seemed like a good idea is too expensive, so we're not doing it anymore. Okay? So the big thing here is basically the state of Texas was ordered to reverse course and go back to providing this guy meals. But the question that led it to the Supreme Court was whether or not the state of Texas was liable to that guy or to the state of Texas, or to that guy, for money damages for depriving him of his religious liberties. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, you know what? Federal courts...
He's in prison, right? This guy's in prison.
Federal courts can tell states what to do, but they can't pick their pocket.
Is it a federal prison or a state?
It was a state prison. So anyway, this is a case that just came down, and in religious liberty circles, there's been a very active conversation because it makes it harder to collect money damages against a government that infringes on people's constitutional rights. What language does the government understand better than any other? Taking money away from them. I've done 5 cases against the city of Portland. It was one after another, similar issues. Every single case I cited as controlling authority the first case that I ever won against the city of Portland. And in 3 of the 5, by God's grace, I was talking to the same judge who issued that first decision.
And that's good, right? Yeah.
That's good. The learned court came up with the right answer back then. But you know what finally made an impression? The city of Portland had to get out its checkbook and write sizable checks to people it didn't want to write checks to, and north of $250,000 to the lawyers involved that I was working with. By the way, that comes out of general funds. So those of you who live in the city of Portland,
Thank you very much.
they did not have insurance for that. So that's why there's been a lot of discussion about this whole thing. So the law is still evolving on this whole 11th Amendment thing, but that's where we are now. Jeff?
How, if at all, does this have relevance to the Arizona immigration law, where Arizona is being sued by the federal government?
Well, that's to make the state of Arizona stop. That's a preemption argument.
What does that mean?
It means the Constitution says the federal government gets to decide national defense and...
Yeah, well, as I understand
and
it,
immigration.
the Arizona law basically copies the federal law and just says, since you're not enforcing this, and you didn't even return our phone calls and do it, then we just would like to enforce it ourselves as a state and basically, you know, enact it in state law what already exists in federal law.
Okay, so Jeff Klon puts out an edict saying exactly what the federal government says, and says it's time to put a stop to this nonsense along our borders. Does Jeff Klon have the authority to do that even though he's parroting the federal government?
Well, maybe not as a private citizen, but I thought this was the whole state.
True, but if the Constitution gives that authority to the federal government, then does the state have the right to say,
Sounds like they don't.
we're going to take matters into our own hands?
Does the federal government have the prerogative to ignore their responsibility completely?
Well, there's a question, isn't it? And I don't know if the discussion ever got to this point, but for the state of Arizona, there's a whole bunch of baggage that comes along with leaky borders.
With what?
Leaky border.
In other words, the state of Arizona
Oh, yeah.
has to deal with a lot of those problems because the federal government isn't doing its job. So, could the state of Arizona say, well, since you're causing all kinds of grief for us by not doing the job, we're going to do the job because certain things are within our territory? I don't know how that discussion played out because I haven't read the opinions in the briefing, but that's the...
Is that still in process?
No.
But you understand how the problem really exists because the average citizen, at the end of the day, doesn't really know about this. In other words, the average citizen is not requiring its federal government, his federal government, to act appropriately.
Well,
So if you look at the opinion polls about who's right and who's wrong, in that case between Arizona and the federal government, you know, you would think it should be overwhelmingly on Arizona's side. But it's not. And that's why the federal government can get away with it.
So if people don't understand what the problems are, then you have to